Hello and welcome back. This is the week 9 lecture. So now that we have finally finished Wieland, at least I hope we have by now that we're returning from spring break, we can start on our next text, which is a very different book. So this week we are starting on Hiko Tenkatl, which is a very difficult name for me to pronounce. I'm going to be shortening our character's name because, of course, our title is the same as the name of our protagonist, so I will be referring to him as X the Younger for the most part to distinguish him from his father, X the Elder. This is a very peculiar book, and it's very different from what we've been reading thus far. So I've already provided some historical context in the Week 9 module. I don't want to rehash all of that. I will mention some of it. It's important that we know a little bit about the historical time period that we are in now. So we're kind of making a leap in terms of time. So as we know, we've spent a lot of time so far in the 1790s. So virtually everything that we've read for the first half of the semester was really confined to a roughly 20 to 25 year period. We started with some text from the 1770s, and then we looked at a few things from the 1780s, but mostly we've been in the 1790s with most of our major works. The Coquette, Reuben and Rachel, Modern Chivalry, and of course, most recently, Wieland. All of those works were published in the 1790s within, in some cases, just a few years of one another. A lot of them came out at the very end of the 1700s. So if you remember with Wieland, we were at the very sort of hinge point between the 18th and 19th centuries. Wieland came out in either 1798 or 1799 at the very end of the 18th century. So that was a pretty fertile period in early American literary history, as we've seen. We had a lot of authors working at around the same time. We remember, of course, the first American novel technically came out in 1789. That was The Power of Sympathy by William Hill Brown, one of those early examples of a seduction plot, a sentimental novel, somewhat similar in terms of subject matter to The Coquette. So we've already been exploring those early days of American literary history. Now we're jumping ahead a couple of decades and we're moving into the 1820s. So we are jumping. And why are we doing that? Well, a couple of reasons. And we don't have to go through every single particular right now. But one thing that I just want you guys to understand is that we're kind of going through a generational change. So in the 1790s, we kind of had the original generation of American authors. Rowson, Hannah Webster Foster, Brackenridge, obviously Charles Brockton Brown was a very important figure in those early days. So they were all active, again, around the same time. They were all contemporaries of one another. And a couple of them continued to write fiction into the early 1800s. So Rowson kept writing. Brackenridge kept putting out additional volumes of Modern Chivalry up until like 1815 or 1816, something like that. Even Brown produced a couple of novels after Wieland in the first couple of years of the 19th century. So some of those originals kept writing a little bit into the 1800s, but they kind of melted away over the course of the first 2 decades of the 19th century. And a new literary generation sort of came along to replace them. And that generation, the next generation that we're going to be exploring, largely consisted of Washington Irving, Catherine Maria Sedgwick, a couple of authors that we're going to be reading in the next few weeks. So we're going to pick up with some of those figures. And this is not to say that there was absolutely no literary production during the first, say, 2 decades of the 19th century. There was, and like I said, Brackenridge was still writing, Ralston was still writing. Joel Barlow, who we read back at the beginning of the semester, he was still writing into the early 1800s. In 1807, he published a sort of an epic poem based on Columbus that we're not going to read, but it was pretty popular in its time. So literature was still being produced, but it's not really until we get to the 1820s that we have a new generation of writers led by Washington Irving, who in many ways becomes the first famous American author, particularly famous overseas. So we'll get to him in a few weeks. So that's kind of where we're going. We're moving ahead to a more productive era as we get new voices, exciting new talents beginning in the 1820s that will help to take American literature to new places. So we're going to be exploring all of that in the weeks to come. But for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be exploring this strange book that's not like anything else on our syllabus. And there's some obvious reasons for that. So number one, I know my light's kind of weird today. I can't get my lamp just right. I don't know if you guys can see this. This is the edition that I ordered, and this is what I hope everybody has. So this is the most recent, the most definitive version of this text. This is from the University of Texas, came out in 1999, and there's a good introduction written by our translator, Guillermo Castillo Falou. He writes a brief but helpful intro. So I want you guys to read that introduction along with the first 3 books of the novel. So there are 6 books total, and I want you guys to get through the first 3. So we're just tackling the first half of the novel this week, and we will cover the second half, obviously, next week. So it's not a ton of reading. I think book 3 ends around page 77. So you're knocking out roughly 70 pages of text along with that short intro, which is only about 5 pages. So not a ton of reading, but you might find that this book is kind of slow going, and there is a lot of text per page. They squeeze a lot of text on each page. So 70 pages might feel like more than 70 pages. So hopefully it's a manageable load. Like everything else, we're spending 2 weeks on this book. So however that best works for you, just try to get finished with it by the end of week 10. So it was published anonymously. It was originally published in Spanish, another way that it's different from the other texts that we're exploring. But like everything else that we're reading, it was published in the United States. So the publication history is very interesting here. I include a little bit about it in the module. I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's not really our focus. But there's been some interesting detective work, mostly done by Latin American scholars and critics. This book has only been studied in American literature classes for the last couple of decades, really. I mean, since roughly this edition came out back in '99, it was studied by Latin American scholars for a long time, but it's only recently become of increased interest to American lit scholars and critics. And before we go any further, I just want to talk a little bit about the way we use these terms, American lit, what that means, and why it's become kind of a problematic thing in recent years. So you guys might have already noticed this. When we talk about American lit in North America, in sort of the former English colonies, what we mean when we say American lit is North American lit in the English language tradition. But we exclude Canada too. So we're really just talking about the United States. We're just talking about the literature produced in the United States. And obviously that is a pretty narrow and restrictive sort of definition because, as we know, the Americas are much larger than just the US. So we have North America, we have Central America, and of course South America. So increasingly, American lit scholars in the US are trying to tackle or trying to really adopt a more expansive sort of just a larger conception of what American lit might really mean. So we're starting to consider more texts that came from Mexico or the Caribbean or various parts of South America. So just sort of expanding our horizons and thinking more about hemispheric history. Not just the history of the US, but looking for connections and links that might bind the US with other former colonies, places like Mexico, countries in South America, countries in the Caribbean, and finding common ground. Even though these places have different histories, they also have a lot in common in terms of their colonial pasts, slavery, and certain artistic creations and traditions. So we don't have time to get into all of that, but it's just a new trend, and it's not even really all that new anymore. It's been going on for a few decades now in the upper reaches of American Lit, so in graduate programs. These are some things that American Lit scholars are thinking about. So that's just kind of interesting to keep in mind, but it's also not a brand new impulse, because if we go back to Reuben and Rachel just for a moment, we'll notice that Rowson was kind of interested in a small way. She was interested in also kind of creating a larger hemispheric history that went beyond just the US. So we talked about Rowson as sort of being a transatlantic writer, and that was obviously true because she was English born, largely American bred. She lived in both places, wrote in both places. A lot of her American novels were also published in England. So yeah, she was transatlantic, but her book was kind of hemispheric. Reuben and Rachel, because if you remember in the early stages of her sort of alternative history, we end up briefly in the Caribbean with Columbus, and then later we're in Peru. And if you remember, the protagonist of Volume 1 of Reuben and Rachel, Columbia Arundel, she descends, at least on her mom's side, she descends from Peruvian royalty, right? Inca royalty. Because the daughter of the Inca king marries Columbus's son. And of course, that's all made up. But that's the kind of fusion or the kind of hemispheric history that Rowson kind of envisions, at least in the early stages of that book. And then, of course, we end up back in Europe, and then we go to the US later. So she's not super interested in these other parts of the Americas, but she is at least aware that the history of conquest and colonization in the New World is bigger than just the history of the US. It's bigger than just British America, right? There's also Spanish America. And in terms of land size, in terms of population, and in terms of the duration of the European Empire, Spanish America was older, in some ways bigger, and in some ways a bit more advanced, or at least more advanced early on than British America. So, of course, this is well known to scholars and critics in other parts of the Americas, but the version of history and the version of literature that we often get in the U.S. schools. See, I mean, I'm falling into it right now. We often say America when we really just mean the U.S., which I think is a flaw that we are increasingly trying to correct. But old habits die hard. So we're trying to understand the Americas in a bigger sense. So this book will help us to do that. It's telling a pretty familiar story of conquest and colonization, but we're getting this story from a slightly different perspective now. We're getting a slightly different angle. So again, going back to the historical sort of context and the interesting publication history here. So this book was published in 1826 in Philadelphia. And again, we don't know for sure who the author was, but it's almost certain that the author was a native of Spanish America. Maybe even a native-born Spaniard. We're really not sure, but we have some ideas. Again, the book was originally published in Spanish in Philadelphia, in 1826 and published anonymously. So the 1820s were a pretty important time overall in the history of the Americas. This was a time of great change and revolution, as a lot of Spain's former colonial holdings were fighting for their independence. So over the course of the 1820s, most of what had previously been Spanish America or Spanish colonies were increasingly becoming independent nations, just as the U.S. had done roughly, almost 50 years earlier. So, for example, Mexico had become independent in 1821. Peru becomes independent in 1824, and within the first quarter or so, roughly the first 25 years of the 19th century, within that period, all of the former Spanish colonies in what was thought of as the New World became independent, with just two exceptions. Cuba and Puerto Rico remained under Spanish control up until, I believe it was 1898. I'm no historian, so I might be getting some of these details wrong, but those two colonies remained Spanish-owned until the Spanish-American War, which concluded, I think, in 1898, at which point we took possession, the U.S. took possession of Puerto Rico, and it remains a U.S. territory to this day, as you all probably know. And Cuba was occupied by the U.S. military for like 4 years until Cuba became independent, I believe, in 1902. Pretty late in the game, but at least they finally got there. So the 1820s was a time of great tumult, a time of great change, but a time of independence, right? A time of revolution. So we're thinking that the author, and again, this work has been done largely by Latin American scholars over the years, so I'm just drawing mostly on what our translator, what Guillermo Castillo Falú tells us in the intro. But he mentions that there have been a few ideas or theories about who the author might have been. Some people think he might have been a Mexican writer. Others think he might have been a Cuban. But he was probably in exile. He was probably living in the U.S., perhaps because he had been forced out of his home country due to his political leanings or some of his writings. Again, by 1826, most of the former Spanish colonies had become independent, but we don't know exactly when this book was written. So it's possible that the book was actually written a few years prior, while some of these wars for independence were still going on. So like we see in the intro, it might have been dangerous to actually publish this in Mexico or in Cuba or some other part of what we might still think of as like Spanish America or Latin America. It might have been dangerous when he was writing. He might have been writing during a lot of those conflicts, during a lot of those struggles for freedom. So he publishes it in Philadelphia, and using some of these findings from previous scholars, we see in the intro that one of the more likely identities, one of the more likely answers to the question of who is the author, is a Cuban priest named Felix Varela, who we know was living in Philadelphia, at least briefly, in 1824. So it's possible that maybe he was working on this at the time. He later moved to New York City, as we learn in the intro, and while in New York City, he started putting out a Spanish language newspaper that was published by the same publishing house in Philadelphia that put out the novel. So there's a lot of strong evidence linking Varela to the book. And again, he was a Cuban-born priest who we know spent time in the U.S. We don't know a ton of other things about him, but there is evidence linking him and suggesting that he was the author. But of course, we will never really know. But we do have some evidence. We also need to think a little bit about the style here. So the story that's being told, I think, is familiar to us already, although there are some nuances and differences that I want to call to your attention. but we can handle the content or the subject matter pretty easily, but the style is a bit difficult for modern readers. So I just wanted to say a few things about this. The style that we see here is often considered to be neoclassical. And this is a phrase that I've used before. It's been a while, but if you remember back in the early part of the semester when we read Joel Barlow, The Hasty Pudding, and even when we talked a little bit about Brackenridge, I mentioned neoclassicism in England as sort of a type or a style of art, and it can refer to a lot of different things. So we can talk about neoclassicism in literature, we can talk about it in visual art, we can talk about it in architecture, whatever. But typically with English literature, and again, I'm falling back on what I know, which is the English language tradition. It's a little bit different with other literary traditions, but when we talk about neoclassic style in English literature, particularly in England, we're thinking about the period from late 1600s up through about the first half of the 1700s. And I've mentioned this period before. This is kind of an important period for us because it's during this time that we see some of those early English language novels being produced in England. Early sentimental novels, seduction tales, that would later influence stuff like The Coquette. So we've already talked about that. And we also talked about the satirical works that were often popular, works by authors like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. So what neoclassical really means is just like a return of older styles and literary forms. So we talked about the epic poem as an example of an older literary form that sort of made a comeback during this era in England. And writers like Pope and Swift and like Barlow and Brackenridge in the US, they sort of used this sort of old-fashioned style that was often sort of suited for heroic themes or epic subject matter. And they used that style for subject matter that was often very common or comic or silly or kind of just routine in certain ways, and that was kind of the joke that they were trying to make. So if you remember The Hasty Pudding by Barlow, and this is even kind of the register that modern chivalry is operating in. It's satirical. The language and the style is supposed to make us think of sort of lofty things. But then what's actually happening, all the silliness that Farrago and Teague are getting into, is supposed to be sort of in stark contrast to that elevated style. So it's using elevated style for silly stuff. Barlow does that. It's supposed to be funny. Okay, so that was very characteristic of the period. So that's kind of what the neoclassical period was all about. But even though they were sort of bringing back these older forms and having fun with them or doing different things with them, they weren't always using them for satire. But even though they were doing that stuff, they were also developing the early English language novel. So it's kind of paradoxical. On one hand, it was an era that was sort of defined by a return to the old stuff, but then also it was kind of about the production of certain new forms, particularly as it pertains to the novel. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here. Again, the neoclassical tradition for Spanish writers and for other European literary traditions would be a little bit different from what I just described, but we're dealing with a lot of similarities, especially in terms of how the style sort of registers to us as modern readers. So we're dealing with kind of a slow-moving plot here, sort of highly rational, or what we might think of as highly reasoned dialogue. We have these long exchanges of dialogue in which characters are often sort of trying to make complex arguments, so they're trying to use logic and rationality to kind of arrive at the correct conclusion. That was typical of the period. And also a certain kind of moral elevation is sort of what we're going for here. And also elevation in terms of diction and, just sort of like the writing style, very formal, a little stiff, might not always make for the most interesting reading experience, so we have to get used to the style. And again, I think it's a little bit different in some ways from what we've been seeing. It's a little different than Brown's Gothic style, although again, the formality of the language, the word choice, and the sentence structure might remind us a little bit of Brown and some of these other writers that we've already seen, because Brown, like a lot of the other early American writers that we've seen, they were influenced by the neoclassical period in England. And this author, whoever he was also kind of influenced by a lot of those same currents, a lot of those same stylistic characteristics. So that's all I really want to say about that. As far as the actual story goes, again, it's pretty straightforward, and we get a nice little plot summary in the intro. But our hero here is Hiko Tincatl. Okay, he is the young military leader of the Tlaxcalans, a Native American civilization in central Mexico that really takes center stage here. So this is the time of sort of first contact between the Spanish and the original inhabitants of modern day Mexico. So we're around 1519 here. Okay, not too long after initial sort of exploration began at the tail end of the previous century. So what's happening now is Cortez is leading the Spaniards into Mexico, and ultimately they will sack and conquer the Aztec Empire. Now, as Americans, I think we know who the Aztecs are. We know that the center of their government is modern-day Mexico City. And we know that this was a scene of great bloodshed and pillage, and this was an early episode of conquest. A similar scene played out in Peru between the Spanish and the Incas. And again, these were the two biggest population centers in the Americas at the time of the Spaniards' first arrival. So these were pivotal moments in the creation of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. So we pretty much know that. I think most Americans know that basic narrative. But when we think of the Aztecs, we often think of them as kind of a monolith. We think that everybody in Central America was Aztec, and it was just one big empire comprised of a lot of the same people, and they were the ones defeated by Cortez and the Spanish. But what we learn in this book is actually a lot more complicated than that. So yes, the Aztecs are sort of the rulers of the overall region, and they have established an empire. They were sort of recent arrivals, we think. They had moved into the area maybe about 200 years prior, and they had defeated a lot of the other tribes who already lived there. So what they had done is created an empire in which they had a lot of vassal states. They had other Native American societies, other cities, other states, other nations, whatever terminology we want to use. These were vassal states, though. They were subjugated. They were sort of under the thumb of the Aztecs. So they had to pay often very high taxes to the Aztec rulers or some other form of tribute. And they weren't really in control of their own affairs, but they were often culturally distinct from the Aztecs. So most of these groups, the majority of these Native American societies in Central America spoke the same language, or they spoke sort of variations of the same language. They were all Nahuatl speakers. So they had sort of a lingua franca. They could converse with one another. They shared certain similarities, but they were often very culturally distinct. So the Aztecs sort of ruled over a lot of smaller vassal states. And those vassal states weren't necessarily thrilled about the arrangement, as we learned. So there was a lot of animosity towards the Aztecs. They were the sort of bullies, or the boss man, whatever. They were resented. They might have in some ways abused their power. So a lot of the vassal states would later ally themselves with the Spaniards in an attempt to kind of get out from under the oppressive rule of the Aztecs. But of course, that would prove to be a mistake, because they were just trading one oppressive ruler for another. They thought the Spaniards were going to help them. In the end, the Spaniards did to them largely, and in fact, worse than what the Aztecs had done. But then we have the Tlaxcalans. So Tlaxcala is an independent republic. They have a republican-style government with a senate. They're a very sophisticated, advanced civilization. And this state, the state of Tlaxcala, still exists in central Mexico, sort of east central Mexico, a little bit east of Mexico City. I think it's the smallest state in modern day Mexico in terms of like overall land size, but it's still there. And they are not a vassal state of the Aztecs. They are enemies of the Aztecs, but they've been able to maintain their autonomy. They are not as powerful, not as big as the Aztec Empire, but they are separate. They are able to kind of run their own show. They are not a vassal state. They are not subordinate to the Aztecs. We get the feeling, I think it's suggested that they have engaged in military conflict. They've had to kind of fight for their freedom, but when the action begins, they are autonomous. They kind of have their own thing going, and they are, sort of opposed to the Aztec Empire. So this is a very complex social and political environment that the Spanish are attempting to invade and conquer. So again, we get sort of a simplified version, I think, oftentimes in American schools. This is not simply one big empire. As we see on page 7, I actually wanted to start here on the very first page of the book. Again, we're told right off the bat that this is a unique moment in human history. Like we've always had invasions. We've always had conquests throughout history. But this is a different kind of conquest. This is a different kind of invasion. So if you look on page 7, the second paragraph. So that first paragraph, he's just saying, there's always been invasions. We've always seen big, powerful civilizations eventually fall to sort of foreign invasions. We saw that in ancient Rome. You can go back throughout history. But jump down to the second paragraph. But the complete destruction of an immense empire, that would be the Aztecs, of a large republic, that would be the Tlaxcalans, and a great number of other smaller states that occupied a great part of that continent, undertaken and carried out by a band of soldiers on salary and under the orders of a despot who had his throne more than 2,000 leagues away, was a lot reserved for the unlucky inhabitants. Reserved only, that's an important word. Was a lot reserved only for the unlucky inhabitants of Western America. So he's saying, yes, we've seen similar things before, but never an invasion on quite this scale. And never an invasion of such a densely populated, sort of diverse area, carried out by a sort of a professional army under the orders of a king, thousands and thousands of miles away. So this is weird. This is different. The author wants us to understand the sort of exceptional nature of this particular conquest. So when the action begins, one of these sort of vassal states, or one of these smaller civilizations, allies of the Tlaxcalans, they send ambassadors to basically tell the Tlaxcalan Senate, their deliberative sort of parliamentary body. Again, we're supposed to think and recognize that this is a very modern, advanced society with a modern style of government. That's actually a lot more advanced and a lot more modern than the Spanish style of government, as we will see. And that's not the only way that they're superior to the Spaniards. But we get this scene early on where their allies, a couple of ambassadors from one of their sort of, allied tribes, comes to tell them, hey, the Spanish are coming. But initially we get this portrait of the Spanish that's kind of cloaked in mystery. This idea that they might have great powers. They might be supernatural. They have this technology that had not been seen previously in this part of the world. I wanted to just find a brief, the end of their little account here. I think this is on page 12. Well, this is not them talking. Okay, yeah, this is them. Okay, this is still them talking. Invincible men who resemble deities because they sail aboard palaces and control thunder and lightning, arms that are reserved for heaven, ministers of another god superior to ours, who is offended by tyrannies and sacrifices of human blood. So we have this interesting conversation that kind of unfolds in these early scenes where the Tlaxcalans are kind of debating what to do about this invading Spanish force. And they are acknowledging that there is a certain religious tradition amongst some of the Native Americans in this region that claim that there would be this sort of pale-skinned race of people coming from the east who possessed, supernatural or like spiritual powers. And that's true. I mean, anthropologists and historians think that that was part of certain tribes' religion and sort of cultural beliefs. There's evidence of that in other parts of the Americas as well, not just here. But the Tlaxcalans are portrayed as being kind of skeptical of that. The Elder X, who's sort of like their president or their appointed leader, again, they have this parliamentary sort of style of government where most decisions are reached by their Congress or their Senate, but it seems like the Elder X, the father of our hero, he's sort of like the president. He doesn't have absolute power like a king, but he's sort of the main guy, but he's like been elected. He's been given that power by the people, which again should ring a lot of bells for us. And we're supposed to, as audience members, think that this is all very modern, sophisticated, and again, this is a mirror in many ways of what was going on in the 1820s. These battles for independence and this sort of Republican or Democratic ideal that a lot of these countries were striving for, just like the U.S. had previously. So they're skeptical of the kind of religious interpretation, and young X, our hero, the young military leader of the Tlaxcalans, he's very skeptical of the Spanish. He does not think that they've come in peace. He sees through a lot of their lies. He thinks that they're deceptive. He thinks that they are there for conquest. But then we get the corrupt congressman, the corrupt Tlaxcalan. So we get sort of this diverse cast of characters here, not stereotypes, not the noble savage stereotypes that we would have often seen in U.S. narratives about, conquest in the early days of colonialization. So we have Magnus Katzen, who's the corrupt senator who ends up kind of becoming a buddy of Cortez. He's in league with the Spanish, and he works to undermine young X. And he's encouraging cooperation and alliance with the Spanish. Young X, being virtuous, brave, and noble, of course, recommends the opposite course of action. So let me stop part one there. We'll come back for part two and actually cover at least most of the main events that we see in the first three books.